So Unity's input system is pretty powerful and it's a huge improvement from the old one. However, the documentation is still pretty light and there aren't many good examples out there on how to fully utilize it. In my last tutorial, I showed a very basic example of how to set up a local co-op scene with 2 players navigating through a maze using the new input system for Unity. So if you missed that, I would recommend checking that out. I thought it would expand on this concept by adding a player setup screen where players they join and then they pick a color and then those players are then loaded into another scene. So this tutorial will be a more in-depth walkthrough of how to use the new input system to persist player inputs across multiple scenes in a more robust and generic way. So you can follow along by downloading my repository in GitHub, or you can run the finished version, which will also be included in the repository. So all those links are in the description below. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where I will post regular game dev related videos and tutorials every other Friday. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so we're back here in our maze scene from my last video. So let's create a couple new materials to give our players some options besides just blue and red. So I'll just quickly do that now. I'll do that by duplicating, Control D, purple, and we'll give this a nice purpley color. And we'll create another one and we'll call this orange. Also, there is a new version of the input system package, so let's make sure we have that updated and installed. So I can go to in project, I can find the input system, see we're in preview 5, and if I go down here we can update to 1.preview 6, so I can go ahead and do that. Alright, so we're updated using the new input system package version, and now we're going to create a new scene to set up our players. We'll call this player setup. Alright, so in this scene we're going to have a UI, so let's just change the main camera from a skybox to a solid color, and we'll just pick a color we want. I'll go with this dark gray here. And now we're going to create a UI object, create a new game object, and we'll call this main layout. And we'll add a component on here. We will go to layout and select a layout group, and then we also need to add a UI canvas. So go add component and we'll type in canvas and we'll select canvas. I'll just move this up. So canvas, we want to render screen space overlay. And then our horizontal layout group, we will uncheck child force expand height and width, and we'll use child scale size width and height, and then we'll also do the alignment to be middle center. So what this will do is as we add items to this group, it will use the child's height and width, and the layout group won't mess with the proportions of the panels. Okay, so now we're going to need a game object to handle player joining and to hold all our different player configuration data. So we're going to have them be able to pick a different color, and this is also going to store what input they're using, so like which controller they're using. So we are going to create a new game object and we are going to call it PlayerConfiguration.Manager. And then we're going to add a new script for this class. We'll call it PlayerConfiguration.Manager. Alright, so in this PlayerConfiguration.Manager, we don't need start and update, so let's delete that. And what this class is going to do is it's going to be like a central place that any scene can access this class to get the different player configs, and the player configs being what color they are, what player number they are, and what player input they are using. So we're going to need an object to store that data. So let's below this class, let's create a class in this file. You can use it in a separate file if you want, but I'm just going to add it here. for simplicity's sake. So we'll call this public class player configuration. And we'll add some properties to it. So let's add a player input. And I need to import the Unity Engine Input System namespace, so that's added up to the top. And we'll call this input. And then next we'll add player index. And we'll add a bool for is ready. And what that's for is after they pick their color, they'll click the ready button, so they're ready to go to the next screen. And then we'll add a material that we will use to set the player's color. Alright, so we have our player configuration. So now let's make a property on this class. Use a list, player configuration. We'll just call it player configs. Alright, so now we also want to control how many players we need ready in order to advance to the next scene. So we'll just create a field that we can change in the editor by making it serialized field, and then we'll add a int, and we'll just call it max players and initialize it to 2. Alright, so we want this player configuration manager to be the only one in our game. So how to do that, we're going to use what's called the Singleton pattern, and all that means is that allows us to access this class, its single instance from any game object and any scene, as long as it's active. And the Singleton pattern ensures that only one instance of this class is ever active at a time. So how we're going to do that, we are going to create a public static player configuration manager. So we're going to have a property on this class. We're just going to call it instance. It's going to have a public getter, and we're going to do private set, and I'll show you why. So we're going to add our awake function. So when this class awakes, so if our instance is not null, instance not instantiate. Let me fix that. Alright, we're just gonna log trying to create another instance. Just let us know that something bad is happening. We don't want that, so we can fix that if that ever happens. Else instance equals this. Instantiate. Instance equals this. And then we're going to also call don't destroy unload instance. So what this will do is this will actually move this object to a special scene within that the Unity engine uses to persist game objects across different scenes. So when a new scene loads, this one will not be destroyed. And then we'll also initialize our player configs. Goes new list, player configuration. Alright, so now in this class we're going to need a couple methods to set up our players. So this player configuration class down here takes player input, so let's create a constructor for this that takes in a player input. Let's call it PI. And then in the method body here we'll do player index equals PI dot player index, and input equals PI. Alright, so then back in our player configuration manager class, let's add So we're going to need a method to set the color and a method so that the player can see they're ready. So let's add a new public method, set player color, and we're going to need the player we're setting and a material. And if you're wondering why I'm doing all this, it'll make sense as we start building out the rest of the components for this system here. So set player color. So player configs index dot player material equals color. All right, so we're going to take our local player configs, and we have the index, so we're just going to set the player material property on that object to be this color that we're passing in. All right, so then we also need a function for ready player. So we'll do public void ready player int index. So what player is currently being readied, and then we'll do player configs index is ready equals true. All right, so then once we also want to check if all the players are ready. So I'll do if player configs.count equals max players. So if we have if all the players are joined and player configs, we're going to do a link expression dot all, and I need to import the system link namespace system.link. So this is going to take an expression. So if all, we'll do p, this is called a lambda expression, p dot is ready equals true. So basically, if all the player configs in this player config collection, the isReady property is true, then, and we have the total count equals to max players, then we're going to, we'll just do scene manager, and have to import the Unity engine.scene management namespace to use this class, and we'll load scene. Our scene name is sample scene, which is the same name as our maze scene. Okay, so now if we go back to Unity in our Player Configuration Manager, we'll add our Player Configuration Manager script. We have our max players, and now we're going to add our PlayerInputManager. Alright, so we're going to use invoke Unity events. Joining behavior, we'll do join when buttons pressed. Player prefab, we'll need to create a new one of these. Limit number of players, we'll do 2. Alright, so we're going to need a handler for player join event. So if we go back to our Player Configuration Manager, we will also add a method for this. So public void handle player join, and that takes in a player input. And let's just add a quick message here, player joined, and we'll just spit out the player index so we know what player number joined. So if you remember from the last video, when a player joins, it's going to add the whatever prefab we specify for the player prefab into the scene. And since we want the Player Configuration Manager and its inputs to persist across scenes, we're going to have to reparent those prefabs, and we'll just put them under this Player Configuration Manager so that they'll go along for the ride when we go to the next scene. So how we do that, we have the player input object that is a reference to the player input component on the player prefab that was spawned. So in this handler method, what we'll do is we'll do PI transform, set parent, and we'll just say transform. So we'll set this player input transform to be our transform, so it'll become a child of this player configuration manager object. All right, and then we'll do if player configs any dot player index equals pi dot index. Basically checking the player index to make sure we haven't already added this player. Player configs dot add, and we'll say new player configuration, and that's the constructor. So we'll pass in our player input that we got from the handler here. All right, so that's all we need to do here. You know what, we should probably put this in this under this check too. All right, so let's add our player configuration object. So let's add a new game object, player configuration. And then on here, we're going to want the player input component actions. So let's set our actions to be our player controls from our last video, and then UI and camera, we can also leave that blank, and we'll change this to C# events. This is a different way of handling the input, and I'll show you that later. So then we will save this player configuration as a new prefab. Alright, so then we can delete this and then go back to our player configuration manager, and the player prefab will be our player configuration. So just drag that in here. Okay, so now we have our player prefab set up. So now let's wire up this player input manager. So when a player joins, we will select our player manager script function, player configuration manager, handle player join. Okay, and let's also save this as a prefab. Okay, so now we need a menu for when a player joins to be added to this main layout. So now we're going to create a player setup menu. So right click and go to UI, and we will choose canvas, and we'll call this player setup menu. And then under here, we're going to create a game object, and we'll call this menu. And we'll create another one, and we'll call this ready. Alright, so then we're going to also add under UI, we're going to add text mesh pro text, and we'll call this, and you may get this dialog. We need to import text mesh pro, so we're going to import the TMP essentials. That's all we need for this. Alright, so now we'll close that window, and we'll call this title. And we'll just position this up. Set our anchor point to the top, and right about there looks good. And let's also control the size of this. So let's make a panel component that we can put all this stuff on. So let's add UI panel and call it setup panel. And we'll grab all of these groups and put them under here. And then setup panel, we will set our anchor point to be the center, and we'll set our width to be something like 400 and our height to be 300. Okay. And our background color image we can set to be whatever, color we want. We'll just make a nice little blue. We're gonna add some buttons and a help text. So let's go to UI text mesh pro. We'll call this set color prompt. Select a color, and we'll make this a smaller size, like 24. We'll set the anchor to be on the left, and 0. And we'll move this up just a little bit. And then we're going to add some buttons. So under the setup, under the menu object, we're going to add UI Text Mesh Pro button. And I'm just going to duplicate this. So we have 4 buttons, and this one's going to be called red, blue, orange, purple. Alright, so the color we're gonna change. Alright, so this one's gonna be red, so we're gonna move this over to here. Blue we're gonna move over here. Orange we're gonna move down, say -40. And we'll fast forward while I quickly arrange these buttons. Alright, so with the buttons arranged, we're going to also change our colors. So this is going to be red. And blue, we're going to change to be blue. Orange. Purple. Yeah, I know it looks pretty hideous, but this is just an example. And let's also change the text. Red. Blue. We're gonna hide this menu just temporarily, and then in the ready, we're gonna add a UI Text Mesh Pro text and call this ready text. And we'll just change this to say ready, if I can spell it correctly. And we'll just center this. And then let's also create a button, UI Text Mesh Pro button, and we'll call this ready button. And we'll just call it, make this say ready up. And let's make this a little bit bigger so it covers up that text. Alright, that looks good. Alright, so now we're going to hide this, go back to our menu and show it. So now we need to set up the button navigation, and this is going to be important because we're going to have multiple panels on the screen, and we don't want it to be possible to go across panel for the different players. So what we're going to do is, so this is going to be a little bit tedious but necessary. So for each of our buttons, we're going to go down to the button component, and under navigation, we're going to say set it to none and then set it to explicit. So if we're on the red button and we go up, we want to go to orange. So I'm just going to drag orange. Also, if we're on the red button and we go down, we want to go to orange again. Left, we'll go to blue. And right, we will also go to blue. Okay, and then now for the blue button, I'll do the same thing. None, explicit. Up, we're going to go to purple. Down, we're going to go to purple. Left, we're going to go to red. And right, we're also going to go to red. Now for orange, same thing. So when you go up, you're going to go to red. Down, we're also going to go to red. Left is going to go to purple. Right is going to go to purple. And then purple, same thing. Blue. Blue. Orange. And orange. Alright, so now I have my button set up, and if I click on visualize, focus on the button here, you should see the arrows should look something like this. Alright, cool. So now we need to add a script to this panel that will interact with our Player Configuration Manager. So I'm going to add that. So we'll click on our player panel here. I'll just collapse these to make some room. And we'll add a new script. Player setup menu controller. Alright, we'll open this up. So start, we don't need that. This menu is going to need to know what player it is, so we'll add a field, private int, player index. Alright, so we're also going to want to set the title text to be the player number, so select player 1, player 2. So we'll add a serialized field, private, and that's a text mesh pro, so we need to make it be a text mesh pro UGUI is the type, and we're gonna have to import that namespace. So using TM Pro, we'll call this title text, and then we want to toggle the visibility of the ready panel and the menu panel. So we're gonna add references to those game objects. Alright, also, so when you join, you hit the A button or whatever button to join, but if you hit the A button, it's going to spawn in a menu, and then it's also going to read that menu as an input, so it's going to pick the first color. So what we want is the menu to appear and ignore inputs for like a second, just so that the player can see the colors and then pick the one they want. So we're just going to add a float, and we'll call it ignore input time 1.5f. So for the first 1.5 seconds, we're not gonna register any A button clicks. Input enabled, so I add a bool as well. Alright, so we're gonna want a function to set the player index for this panel. So we're going to add a public void set player index int pi. Alright, so our player index field will be pi, and then we're going to set our title text. So title text dot set text, and we'll make it say player plus. Alright, so indexes start at 0, that's not really user friendly, so we're going to do pi plus 1 dot toString. So that way player 0 will be player 1 and player 1 will be player 2. And then we're going to set our ignore input time to be time.time plus ignore input time. It's basically the current time plus 1.5 seconds. Alright, so then we're in our update function. If time.time is greater than ignore input time, we're going to set our inputs enabled flag to be true. So now we need to create methods for our buttons. So we have color buttons and we have the ready button. So we're going to add public void set color. This is going to take in a material, and if our inputs are not enabled, we just want to return. Alright, so now we're going to actually start using our Player Configuration Manager. So I can just do Player Configuration Manager dot instance. So give me that instance, which will allow me to call all these methods. So I'm going to call set player color, player index. It's going to pass in our player index and the color. And then we're going to want to ready panel set active false true. Got that mixed up. Ready panel set active true, and you know what? We're also going to need a reference to our button, so we can give it focus. Otherwise, you won't be able to navigate to it since our navigation is explicit. So private button, ready button. Nope, that's not ready. Private button, and we're gonna have to import the Unity Engine UI. Call this ready button. Ready button select. So that will focus the ready button. And then we also want to set the menu panel set active false. Hide that. Alright, that's all we need to do. And now we also need to make a method for the ready button from when we click that. So we're going to say public void ready player. So if our, once again, I'll just copy this if our inputs are not enabled. I'm just going to return PlayerConfigurationManager instance ready player, and we're going to pass in our player index and ready button set active. Ready button game object set active false. So let's just hide our button. It shows up ready up player's ready text. Okay, so now let's wire up our buttons to these new methods. So in our player setup menu, we need our title text, so we will drag in our title object. We need our ready panel, so that's this, which is currently disabled, which is what we want. We'll drag in our menu reference, and we'll also drag in a reference to our ready button. And now for our red button, we're going to go down to on click at our script, so we're going to drag in ready panel, setup panel, and then we're going to go to player setup menu controller and set color, and then we're going to drag in our red material here. And we're going to have to do this for all of our color buttons, so we'll just quickly fast forward through that. Okay, so our colors are set up, and now we need to set our ready button. So on click, drag in our setup panel, select our setup menu controller, and ready player. Okay. Okay, so the last thing we need to add to our player setup menu before this is fully done is an event system. So let's just add another child here. We'll call this event system. And then under here, we're going to add a multiplayer event system. So this is a new component which will basically allow us to have multiple event systems running for each player, each handling by their own inputs. And then we're also going to add input system. So there's going to be two of them. Make sure you do not select the standalone input module. That is the old one. We're going to add the new input system UI input module. Alright, so under actions, we're going to select our player controls. And then navigation. So under move, we're going to select movement. And submit, we're going to select a new select action. Okay, and then under multiplayer event system, we want our first selected object to be the red button. So we're going to drag that. And then the player root, we're just going to set to be our setup panel. So now we have our player setup menu, and we're just going to make this a prefab. And we will delete this. Okay, so if you remember from our first video, we have our player controls, and it was very simple. We just have a movement action. So we're going to create another action. We'll call this select. And bindings, I'm just going to click on listen and hit the A button on my controller. So we'll do button south. And interactions, we'll make this press. Press and release. Okay, so I'm going to make sure this is saved, save asset. Okay. And now if we click on our input settings, our player controls, we can generate the C# class. So what this will do is it'll generate a class file that we can use to reference our different input actions by name. So, and we'll use this towards the end, but we're just going to go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to click apply, and this will generate this player controls class here with our actions. Okay, so if we go to PlayerConfigurationManager, so when a player joins, we're going to spawn a player configuration, and a player configuration has an input. So when this spawns, we also want to create the player setup menu that we just created. So let's create a script to do that. We'll just say spawn player setup menu. All right. So this is going to be a very simple script. We don't need start and update. So if remember, we called, go back to our scene, we have our main layout. It's called, this is the horizontal layout group. This is called main layout. So let's just find that object and add it. All right. So we're going to add an awake method, and we're going to need a reference to that menu. So we're going to need a reference to that horizontal layout group. So we'll just call it var root menu equals game object find main layout, make sure it's spelled correctly to whatever you named it, and then if root menu does not equal null, basically if we're doing this only on the setup scene, then var menu equals instantiate. So we're gonna have to instantiate the player setup menu into this root menu. So we're gonna need a reference for that. So public game object, we'll call this player setup menu prefab. So we'll instantiate the player setup menu prefab to the root menu transform. All right, and then, okay, so we have, so we spawn the instance of our player setup menu, and then next we also need to set the UI input module to our player input component. So we'll need a reference to our player input. Player input, and you'll have to import the input system namespace. Just call this input. All right, so input dot UI input module equals menu get component in children input system UI input module. And we'll have to import the Unity Engine input system.ui namespace. And then lastly, menu get component player setup menu controller set player index input dot player index. Okay, so now if we go, once again, Player Configuration Manager will spawn a player configuration when a player joins. Player configuration has a player input, and we are also going to spawn our player setup menu. Alright, so we need a reference to our input, so we're going to drag that here. And then player setup menu prefab, we will just drag in our player setup menu. And we will save this. Okay, so now we're ready to test this. I believe I have everything ready so far, so that when we join, we'll see the panels pop up. Let's see if that works. Alright, so hit A on the first controller. And we get a null reference exception. Okay, so I figured out what is going wrong. So our player setup menu has a canvas on it already, and it's conflicting with the canvas that's on our horizontal group. So what we're going to do is just grab our setup panel, which has everything else on it, and we'll make this a prefab by dragging it over here. And then we'll back out of here, and then we'll just delete our player setup menu prefab. So we have our setup panel, and then we'll just rename this to be player setup menu. Okay, and then we'll have to go back and change our player configuration prefab to use our updated menu prefab object. All right. So now if we run this, I hit player 1, that joins, and player 2 joins. Make this a little bit bigger. And it wasn't working. I suspect it's because we have this event system that got created when we add any UI components. So we'll just delete that because we don't need it. And let's try this again. Alright, so player 1 is moving the first menu, and player 2 is moving the second one. Alright. So if I say player 2 is going to be blue and player 1 is going to be orange, and we ready up. It's going to error because we didn't load this scene. But we're going to make some changes to the scene anyways. So our menus work. Awesome. So yeah, dealing with Unity UI is kind of a pain sometimes. It just is. Alright, so sample scene. This is our maze scene. So we're going to make some changes to this. So basically when the scene loads, we want something to grab those player configurations and then spawn the players in the correct spots. So we no longer need our PlayerInputManager since we have our new Player Configuration Manager. Let's create a new object. Call this level initializer. And then we'll also create 2 new empty game objects, and we'll call this player 1 spawn, player 2 spawn. And then we'll go to our player 1, we'll copy the transform component, go to transform, paste component values. paste component values. Level initializer, we want to make sure we are at 0, 0, 0. There we go. Player 2 spawn, player 2, copy component, and paste component values. Okay. And we're gonna need a player prefab. So we can build it with our player object here. So I'm just gonna rename this to be player. All right, we have our mover script, and we need to add a player input handler script. And we're gonna have to make some changes to these, so let's quickly do that. All right, so our mover script, we no longer need a reference to our player index. All right, and then our player input handler, this is going to change as well. All right, so instead of player input, let's add a reference to player configuration. Player config. And we got a reference to our mover. That's good. We still need that. And then serialize field private mesh renderer. So this will allow us to change the color. Player mesh of our object. And then we're going to add a private player controls. And what this is that C# class that was generated from our player controls input configuration. So every time you change this, we just need to update, reapply to regenerate that class. And need to change our wake method here. So player input, we can get rid of that, and index, get rid of that. All right, so we have our mover. We still need that. But it's gonna be a mover, and we're just gonna change this to be get component, and then so grab the mover component, and then we're going to also initialize our controls class. And this will let us reference some of those actions by name through a type. Alright, so we need a method to kind of initialize the player and set the color and all that stuff. So let's add a method called initialize player. And we're going to pass in a player configuration. Oh, is this void? Player config equals PC player mesh material equals config player material, and then we need to listen to the input. So config player config input on action triggered, and this is because we're using C# events instead of the Unity events, which you can manually wire up to the editor. But because we're doing this kind of dynamically, we need to register our own events. So on action triggered plus equal, and then I'm going to hit tab, and it's going to just fill in a handler method for us. Alright, so on action triggers, we have our callback context. We can actually still use our onMove. And how we're going to do this, we need to check what action was performed. So we will do if obj action name equals our controls player movement dot name. So if it's the move, then we're going to call on move. So similarly, if you had other actions that you're looking for this input handler, like a jump or whatever, you would just check for those names and then call that corresponding function. So if anyone has a better way of doing this dynamically with the C# events, I'd be very curious, but this is the method I found that works for this. So now if we go back to Unity, we have our player, we have our input handler and our mover updated now. Player mesh, we need to add a reference, so we'll add a reference to our red cube. And we're going to name this player prefab to be player prefab, and then I'm just going to drag this to our prefabs folder. And now I'm going to delete it along with our player2 object. All right, so level initializer. We're going to add a new script. And we're going to call it initialize level. Okay, we don't need update, just delete that. We will use the start. Alright, so we need a reference to the spawn points for each player. So serialize field, private transform. I'm gonna make this an array. Player spawns. And then we also need a serialized field reference to our player prefab object, so it knows what to spawn. Alright, so then in start, we're going to get our player configs. So var player configs equals PlayerConfiguration get instance get player configs to array. And we don't have that method, so let's quickly add it. Let's go to our PlayerConfiguration and we will add a public list player configuration get player configs, and we're just going to return our player configs. Alright, back to our initialized level. So we're going to loop through these player configs and spawn them in their correct places. So I'm just going to do a for loop. Alright, so I equals 0, I equals player configs dot length, and then var player equals instantiate player prefab, and we're going to want to make this a we're going to want to spawn this player at the position of the spawn point. So player spawns at index I dot position, player spawns index I rotation, and then we'll make it a child of this object. So game object transform, and then player get component player input handler, and we have to initialize the player, call our initialize player method, and we'll pass in our player config at index I. Alright, and then I believe that's all we need to do, so let's give this a shot. Alright, so we have our level initializer script, so we're going to add a reference to our spawn points. So I'll make this size 2, and we'll just drag in each of these. And then we also need a reference to our player prefab, so we'll drag that in as well. Okay, so now we have to set up our players on the setup screen. So we're going to load that scene, player setup, and I'll make this game view full size. Alright, let's give this a shot. Alright, player 1 is going to be orange, and player 2 is going to be purple. Ready up, and ready up. Sample scene. Oh, okay. So we need to allow our scene to be loaded. So we're gonna go to File, Build Settings, and we're just gonna drag our scenes in here and close. All right, let's try this again. Red, purple, and look at that. And it's not working. So I suspect the event is not being picked up. So let's check out our player input handler. Player prefab, player input handler. Ah, okay. So here's our bug. I get our mover, but I store it in a variable instead of storing it to our instance. So I'm going to get rid of this var keyword. Yep, a little stupid mistake, happens all the time. And if we play it, all right, player 1 is going to be orange, player 2 is going to be blue. Ready, ready. All right, and you can see that we are working. So there you have it. Hopefully you can use this pattern or get some ideas from this pattern on how to set up local co-op to persist multiple scenes, kind of a more scalable way of implementing local co-op. If you have any questions or any comments or ideas, feel free to leave a comment below, and if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Bye.